Hi, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment with
Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and welcome to our show. It's the second part of our discussion on the Watchmen. This time we're dealing with two different adaptations. Before we get into the show, I just want to talk about something that's been brought up to my attention, which is for those of you who are liking and subscribing us on the platform Facebook. First off, thank you. It does not send notifications for new updates. Basically, what were you saying, Randall? It kind of just shows up in your feed indiscriminately.
Yeah, the way Facebook works, it's got this thing called a feed. That's the thing you see, the list of just random stuff you see when you sign into Facebook. And there's a computer algorithm that determines what you see in your feed. And so unlike a service like YouTube, you don't get notifications when stuff you like come on. I mean, YouTube's kind of getting like that too. I mean, it's just there's an algorithm that determines what you see.
But if you like and subscribe on YouTube,
I mean, if you love
can
our
get
show,
notifications.
maybe.
Right?
If you like our show
Yeah.
though, and you really want to know when the new episode comes out, you can go to our website. You can subscribe to our email list. Yeah, so those are the two best ways to do it. I
And
mean,
I will say that from what I know as a YouTube subscriber, you will get notifications for our new episodes. Just so you know, ideally, we always post at least one episode a week, and normally it's on a Thursday. So if it's a new week and you are looking for a new episode of ours and it's Thursday, there's a very good chance, at least certainly by Friday, you'll see it.
the plan is Thursday, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.
All right. So once again, thank you for following us. Please continue to follow us. We're in a multiplicity of platforms. All of our platforms have links to our website, which is probably the best way of directly connecting with us. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, we really want to know what you think about. All right, let's plunge ahead into the second half of our show. So just a quick review. Upside down. The Watchmen by Alan Moore and David Gibbons. It was originally a comic book miniseries. It came out between 1986 and 1987. I read it at that time. It changed the way we look at comic books. It took the concept of the superhero and deconstructed it. It dealt with it from a social standpoint, political standpoint. It dealt with sex. It dealt with just about everything you could deal with in a comic book. Dave Gibbons, the artist, used a very traditional format, but he also did amazing things with space. It had secondary source material. It was an alternative reality, but it was very much a reality that was a recognizable one to the one that we were living in the time that the comic came out. The comic was being written as it was also being published. So Alan Moore was kind of working towards an end without a clear desire, knowing where it would lead to. It was very specific to the kind of world that DC Comics had created, where their superheroes were either amazing self-actualized men and women or gods. The comic was definitely more of an adult's comic, though an adult, if you're 13, it blew your mind, and I read it at 20, could blow your mind. But as soon as the comic was done, a producer named Lawrence Gordon, who worked with Joel Silver on things like Lethal Weapon, they optioned the property. DC was owned soon thereafter by Warner Films. And between the years of 1987 and 2005, there was an active trying to get this particular 400-page thing into a reasonable commercial film script. Some of the directors who went through this were such luminaries as Terry Gilliam, Paul Greengrass, Darren Aronofsky, Sam Hamm, the screenwriter who wrote the original Batman movie for Tim Burton, and the story for Batman Returns, wrote the first screenplay version of this because Alan Moore didn't want anything to do with it because he was already in a lawsuit with DC. And in that one, he was the first one to change the ending by putting in a crazy time paradox assassination attempt. Charles McGowan, who was Terry Gilliam's director, a screenwriter. He wrote a version. Gilliam was attached to the project the longest, almost 7 years, and he left when he couldn't get financing. His biggest criticism was that it would take at least 5 to 8 hours to tell the full tale. And he just didn't think he could shrink it down. Greengrass, who's actually now most famous for the Bourne movies, was brought in to replace Darren Aronofsky. David Hayter, the director, wrote his own script, and then Alex Say wrote another version of the script. Hayter said it, brought it into the present day. Say brought it back into the 1980s. And finally, in 2007, they got director Zack Snyder, who had just come off of his big film, The 300, and out it came in 2009. Randall, you were the first person. You saw it before me. So tell me about the film, the Zack Snyder film version. Oh, and I'm sorry, directed by Zack Snyder, who had a background in comic book writing and as well as writing The Watchmen. So go right ahead.
Well, I'd already read the comic book, and when I go to movies, I try to not get any advanced anything. Like, I don't even like to watch trailers. I know I'm weird, but I don't like to watch trailers. I don't like to read reviews. I don't like to see commercials. Like, if it's a movie I definitely want to see and a commercial for on TV comes on for it, I turn the channel. Forget it. And because it's like the film festival experience. When you go to a film festival, sometimes, like back in the olden days, you'd only see like a sentence about the movie and who's in it.
So when you sat down,
so I walk into the movie.
Yeah.
I walk into the movie totally cold. I don't know what it's going to be. I already read the comic. I walk in the movie, and the movie is the comic. I mean, it's amazing, right? I mean, this is like, Snyder's this adaptation is the best. I mean, it blew me away. It was like the greatest adaptation. I don't know if anybody could ever do a better adaptation of a book. I mean, it was just amazing. And they took everything from the comic. The artwork, the backstories, dialogue. I mean, there's a lot of movies, okay, where they think, oh yeah, let's rewrite all the dialogue and make it shorter. I mean, this is a long movie.
I know you really liked the opening credit sequence. You want to?
Yeah, so Zack Snyder, one of Zack Snyder's, I don't know who thought of it, but if it was Snyder, I mean, it was genius. There's a huge, excuse me, there's a huge ongoing backstory in the comic book, right? It's mostly text-based, I think, like from secondary sources, right, in the comic.
Yeah.
And intercut with the main story. And Zack Snyder tries to compress it all into a dialogue-less title sequence. So while the titles are rolling, you see these little vignettes, and he accomplished. He does the job, And I remember criticism at the time, like nobody faulted him for it. People thought it was genius. I mean,
it's a very economic strategy because again, this is so dense with secondary source material and backstories that in just a space of maybe a 2-minute credit sequence, he's able to pretty much summarize. I think this is also around the same time that Wolverine Origins came out, and I cannot for the life of me remember now the director. It's a pretty good director who did Wolverine Origins because he ended up doing the whole Wolverine series. I know he directed Girl Interrupt. It's not helping you. Anyway, the opening credit sequence of Wolverine Origins pretty much summarizes the first 100 years in Logan's life. So you get to see how all of his birth, his fighting in World War I and World War II, and it just keeps on going to the present day. And if both he and Snyder, I thought, really were very good at trying to show the superhero story. Even if you look at it, I think you can see a bit of that in you can definitely see a bit of that in the opening to Superman the Motion Picture, in that you have that 1939 and a boy reading the Action comic book. Less so about the story, but at least it grounds that there is a long history. And the nice collective effect of that opening sequence, I agree with you, is it really establishes very economically the world of the movie, which you don't even really see in regular superhero films, do you?
No. Well, could I also say something else? Is like a lot of regular superhero movies, I guess we're going to be using that terminology. They add a lot, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they they compress, but then they add. And it's always weird the additions you see. I mean, a lot of the additions I always wonder, a lot of times I wonder why they even bothered. I mean, it doesn't add anything, right?
Well,
Sometimes they
I guess
do, but
I'll jump into the conversation in a biographic sense. Look, folks, I thought this in the early 90s. It's the one of the first collected versions. Maybe this is the version you read. It's not in the back. It's not in great shape. The reason why I have this all the time is I have the actual issues sealed and wrapped in a climate controlled condition so no one can touch it. But every couple of years, I just like to go back and I like to read this and look at the pictures and just get my experience. So I guess in some sense I'm very evangelical when it comes to the Watchmen. So I knew about it, and I will tell you, I had always had mixed emotions because I had heard for years that this was going to be in development, and then I saw the trailer, and I heard from a lot of fans that this is not the Watchmen that you want to read. And I remember waiting a couple of weeks, and you and I were on the phone, and there was like no other movie playing, and I said, Randall, should I really see this movie? And you said yes, you should. And on your recommendation, I went. And there are things about this movie I'm probably going to be a little bit more critical of as the discussion evolves. But the one thing that I really think it's important to understand is, in the same way that this was a deconstruction of comic book storytelling, less so from the 80s and more about comic book storytelling from the 40s through, let's say, the 50s and 60s. I would argue that by 2009, we had now had 20 years. It's hard to believe it, but we did have 20 years of superhero films. We had the Tim Burton Batmans, we had the Joel Schumacher Batmans, we had middle films like A Blade, we had Spider-Man, even Iron Man. The first Iron Man movie had come out, at least one Hulk movie had come out. So there was a superhero cinema to deconstruct. And I do feel like on some level, what Snyder is doing very purposefully is deconstructing not just comic books, which is what Moore and Gibbons did, but he's also deconstructing the superhero movie. And
can I just
if you
add
look,
that? Go
oh,
ahead.
sure, I was just going to
Okay.
finish. And the real proof of what I'm saying is, if you look at the Ozymandias costume that Matthew Good wears, it's almost a direct parody of the Joel Schumacher nipple armor that you see in his version of the Batman films.
Right. That's a great example. I just wanted to say I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that yes, just like the comic is a deconstruction of comics, the movie, yeah, it's really looking with a critical eye at past superhero movies. You're totally right about that. And I think that was a very smart thing that Snyder and crew did with the Watchmen movie. Yeah.
I mean, and that's what's kind of interesting. He extended the scenes, the fight scenes. Please remind me, did Sin City come before or after the film version? And I'm sorry, this is really where
Yeah,
you'd
let me
think,
look it up.
because if you look at Frank Miller's Sin City, there are certain also
Yeah, Sin
visual
City was before
similarities.
in 2005, Watchmen's
Excellent.
2009.
So you can even see kind of like there's something about, I would argue, Sin City visually in this. Of course, the 300, even Sam Raimi's Dark Man. You know, the visual iconography. I'm so happy to say that Dave Gibbons, who really adds a lot to the narrative storytelling through visual art, was a contributor to the film and helping get the aesthetic look of the movie. I will definitely say, not since Dick Tracy have I seen a film try so hard to create the 5-color panel and splash pages of a comic book, but to do it in a way that isn't quite so cheesy. It doesn't look like Batman 66.
Well, so Chris, when I told you to go see Watchmen, were you glad you went and saw it?
Personally, felt that, and this is, I think, the one problem. Normally, what I like about film is it adds humanity to comic book characters that the comic just kind of never gets to. And I felt kind of the opposite, in fairness. It's a good cast, but I felt there was a flattening of character. And this is, I think, a critique I have of a lot of Zack Snyder's films and David Hayter's films as well, is that they seemed less like fleshed out people and more like iconographic people. There was a lot more shorthand in establishing character. To the defense of everyone behind the film, Alan Moore and David Gibbons had the luxury of 400 pages. And this film, the theatrical release, and I really want to talk about the other version in a moment, the theatrical release is under 3 hours, just barely. But the level of narrative compression clearly, I feel, works against the film. And it's hard to really say that's Snyder's fault when, you can argue he's a max. If you look at, I didn't realize we were going to get to this so quickly, but I want to get into it. He directed a cut of Justice League that will soon be released, I think, next year on HBO Max. And it's going to be 5 hours versus the theatrical version, which was slightly over 2. And supposedly there's a lot of story. And I guess, in fairness to Snyder, he really packed in, probably in planning the film, he packed in a lot of story. And so much of it gets cut out. And I feel like it does hurt the film. You did see the extended cut. What was that like?
Yeah, the director's cut. There's a Blu-ray version. I think, okay, I'm looking at the IMDb. I think it's called the Ultimate Cut. And it's great. I mean, I think the stuff it adds is just, it makes it a lot better. I mean, it makes the character motivations a lot more interesting. I think that it's been a while since I've seen it, but I think there's a scene somewhere in the middle with Dr. Manhattan that really sets up Manhattan, the ending they created, and much better. I liked it a lot. Also, it's got the animated version of the Black Pearl story within a story that that from what I read originally, they thought they would just stick it in there in the theatrical release. uh, this is like one of the most the Watchmen movie was probably one of the most ambitious adaptations ever. I mean,
you met one of the writers of the film.
I think a friend of mine who's in the Writers Guild took me to a Writers Guild, like I don't know, they showed the movie, and then David Hayter, I think it was, he was interviewed afterwards, and he talked about his experience writing the script. He said that he just took out his old comics of Watchmen, and he just turned them into a script. He just wrote down every single line of dialogue in the comic, and used it as a storyboard and turned that into a script form. And then he started editing that. That's how he started on the script. So that's why it's so.
But it's interesting to point out that Hayter decided to bring it into the modern era. It's Alex Say who wrote another version, which put it back in the 80s, that in both of those, the way are credited in Snyder. But the thing that's, I think, really, and hey, here comes a giant spoiler alert. And I really tried so hard to do this without a spoiler alert, but it's going to be impossible. The thing that Sam Hamm, the first screenwriter, did, and Hayter did, and I guess Say did, is they all made a very big strategic change to the ending of the original graphic novel. I want to spend just a minute back on the graphic novel. So Moore is writing the ending of this issue, the last 3 issues of this miniseries, as about issue 5 is out. And that means that the antagonist's plot it's questionable what he knows as a writer going into this. But the big trick of the story is that Ozymandias, who is a hero, but is really a villain, and this is very much, look, all the Watchmen, one of the key issues about the Watchmen is that by deconstructing the hero, the question is, what is fascistic? Who watches the Watchmen? Who watches that person who is supposed to take care of us? So this hero, Ozymandias, is really the villain. But his great stratagem is to deceive people by thinking that there is an alien race, there's a porthole, and the psychic squid falls on Manhattan, kills half of Manhattan, and in doing so, unites the world against the common enemy. Rorschach is dedicated in this story to exposing the truth, but Manhattan decides for the greater good. It's so important that he actually betrays the code of, if you could argue that Manhattan ever had a code, and he kills Rorschach so that the villainous, if Ozymandias is a villain, I think he is, and who, albeit never brought to justice, gets to perpetuate this myth that brings peace. So the means justify the end. And of course, Laurie and Silk Spectre 2 and Night Owl 2, Dan Freeberg, they realize on some level they're dealing with powers beyond themselves, and they admit basically it's out of their control. And the ending is disturbing. I like the ending, and only in doing some research did I find out that while Moore wrote that ending, it was brought to his attention that the ending is lifted from a 1963 episode of The Outer Limits called The Architects of Fear. And in it, scientists fake an alien invasion to stop World War III. When this is brought to the attention of Moore's editor, Len Wein, and comic book writers have editors just like other writers have. Len Wein, a great comic book writer in his own right, creates the Wolverine and brought in the whole new X-Men. He tells Moore, you either change the ending or I'm going to quit. And Moore says, then quit. So Len Wein leaves the project and quits. So the ending is, it's a toughie on some hands. I mean, because you could almost argue the ending is plagiarized. So the ending of the film, why don't you explain how the film ends?
Well, I want
to the choice they make.
Okay.
So instead of the squid, what do we have?
Okay. Well, first I want to say about the squid is I feel it leaves the reader unsatisfied because one thing that a satisfying narrative does is it creates a hermetically sealed world where, but when you get to the end, whatever the ending is, it's part of that world. So at the end of Watchmen with the giant squid that comes from another dimension, and there's no other dimension, there's not a lot of other dimension stuff going on in the whole book. And the squid just, the squid's not in the rest of the book. I mean, it does feel like, it does feel unsatisfying to the reader. So what the screenwriters do is it's a really faithful adaptation, but there's some squid stuff, right? But what the screenwriters do is they try to make it a more satisfying ending by making the threat to Earth that unites the Earth. Ozymandias manipulates the world into believing Dr. Manhattan has destroyed Manhattan, right?
Right.
And when Dr. Manhattan finds out, Dr. Manhattan only finds out after the fact, after Manhattan's been destroyed and he's been implicated. And it's a great emotional arc in the movie for the Dr. Manhattan character. And I think it's brilliant.
Well, it's really interesting for a number of reasons. First off, Night Owl and Rorschach have a scene, which wouldn't have been in the comic, where basically Owl is warning Rorschach, hey, don't expose, just go along with the plan. And Rorschach calls him on it and says that basically he's a hypocrite and he's scared, and Rorschach isn't.
Right. That's another great scene, but could I just...
sorry, I didn't interrupt.
I just want to finish saying about Dr. Manhattan. It's a great end to his emotional arc as a character, because it finally gives Dr. Manhattan an excuse to leave Earth and humanity forever. Okay? That's something that the book I don't think does. Okay? Because
I agree with you wholeheartedly, because it's an interesting thing. Because think of it this way. Manhattan wants to take the blame. He doesn't want to be a hero. He would rather be reviled. He'd rather be reviled and have peace than be loved and have conflict. Hold on, I want to just finish my point though. Well, that's a very ennobling thought. By the same token, he still kills Rorschach, which means the concepts of good and bad do not run through that Dr. Manhattan's. He doesn't have a question of morality. He's just thinking pragmatically and what's the most efficient solution. And he's also still having the ends justify the means, just like the Moore version So it makes it a slightly more confusing or ambiguous, depending on how you want to say it, ending. Uh, Go on.
Well, I think, well, it's an interesting point you're making, but I really think the ambiguity is up to 11 in both the comic and the movie, and I love it. But yeah, so I just want to say that I think now you tell me, Chris, about your experience, because you've been reading comic books way longer than me. You've read many more comic books than me. I think one of the innovations of Watchmen is it really delves into the motivations of the quote unquote superheroes, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that this is not territory that was really trod by other writers previous to Watchmen. I mean, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but
No, in fact, I would argue that the comic book begins a trend of questioning the ethicality of what it means to be a superhero and the involvement of the state and the superhero. And in both, not just at DC and Marvel, and for the last 20 years, really 30 years, Marvel and DC keep on playing out the whole moral implications. And even you see this in Civil Wars in the Marvel movies. But interestingly enough, I also feel that Snyder's contribution to moving forward in superhero storytelling can also be seen. People often think that Tim Burton's dark and edgy take on the Batman really affected how we did superhero films, but it didn't, because it was immediately followed by Schumacher. And,
no,
Christopher Nolan's Batman, I cannot remember, did it come out the same year as this, or it's around the same time, but I honestly feel that Nolan was not influenced by anything but Nolan, because Nolan doesn't write superhero movies based on superheroes. The superhero is a tool for other kinds of exploration. And I love Nolan, don't get me wrong.
Batman Begins came out 4 years previous to Watchmen.
Right. So I feel like there's no communication between those two films. And I think, but if we look at films like The Joker, the Zack Snyder Batman versus Superman, the Zack Snyder Justice League, even Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman, you're really seeing the legacy of what it's like to question the ethicality. Should a god judge man? Should a god be taken down because he's too powerful? Should a warrior goddess get involved in World War I? All of these things, Aquaman kind of is a throwback movie. I don't see it. I just don't. I love it. It's a great movie, but I don't feel it. But there's enough of the visual component that you see in Aquaman, and the way that the fight scenes and the color scenes that Justin Wayne, I think it is, who directed it, did that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful movie, for sure.
That you can still see coming out of Watchmen. And I really feel that Watchmen finally finds the answer to how do I bring visually and iconographically what makes a comic book into a film. I don't think it does it very well. I don't think the acting is particularly good. I have a lot of problems with it. I don't think it's a great film, but I think it is a seminal film. So moving on to a very strange thing, which is the TV series, the miniseries. So in about 2009, which is only 2 years after the film came out, and the film is just one last word on the film, mixed reaction with both fans and critics. It cost $120 million to make. It made $184 million worldwide. So not a bomb, but not a success.
Could I just say one common criticism of the movie was sometimes you shouldn't do a faithful adaptation. I heard that criticism many times.
I hear that. And there's the old saying that if you want to make a great movie on a book, pick a bad book. It's very hard to take a good book and make it into a good movie. And that's true.
Just for the record, I want to say I love the movie. I thought it was great.
I think we all know that now. So around that time, they did approach, it's not clear in my research whether they were going to make a brand new Watchmen or just give him the space to tell the full Watchmen tale that he had planned to do. But HBO and Snyder worked together on and off for a few years until he backs out around 2015. And then they approached someone really interesting, Damien Lindelof. And if that name rings a bell, it's probably because you know him as one of the co-creators of the TV series Lost with Carlton Cuse. I also had read some comics Damien had written, and I know he had also written for Nash Bridges and Crossing Jordan, but it's really lost that I think really he's best known for. And at the time that he was already running a show that's in many ways going to be a precursor for the kind of thing he would do for HBO, which was an adaptation of Tom Peretta's novel, The Leftovers. The Leftovers takes place in a small town in the Hudson Valley, New York, after the rapture, when a certain percentage of people have gone up, just disappeared. No one knows where they've gone. And yet life continues on in this universe, this I don't want to say post left behind universe. And it deals with multiple storylines. It deals with sexuality, race, class, life in a small suburban town. It deals with a lot of these dynamics and a very strong ensemble, which is my way of saying, hey, if you can rent The Leftovers, rent it. But it's interesting because Lindoff at this time had read an article by Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic. It was the argument made for reparations about what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, when white supremacists literally used helicopters to bomb and destroy.
Well, I think it was airplanes.
Airplanes, sorry. Thank you for the correction. Anyway, to the level of giant, horrifying racism. And it was an interesting notion because Lindoff posts and you can look it up. I could not read it, but he writes a very long letter in Twitter to all of in Instagram, to all the fans of the Watchmen to let them know that what he was doing was not going to be to adapt the story. He calls it a remix, but he wanted to take the world that Moore's comic book had happened. He wanted to jump through today, 34 years in the future. And whereas this is a comic book really about impending nuclear disaster in the Cold War, he wanted to find what was the great other event that fascism promulgates and is in our society. And he dealt with racism, specifically a lot about institutional racism. And that's where he said it. So he found a character, new characters, and old characters in it to tell what I would argue is not, in our pre-discussion, we talk about, is it a necessary sequel or not a necessary sequel? We can get into that in a moment, but it's to answer a question that you rarely see when you do a sequelization, which is, if we accept everything Moore said happened in 1986 or 87, what would that world look like today? And specifically, how does he use that tool to tell the story? So it's a 9-episode miniseries. Originally, it was supposed to be 10, but he actually cut it down by an hour. It does not take place in New York City, but instead it takes place mostly in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He creates a new character named Angela Abar, who is a detective in a world now where police officers hide behind masks or by superhero identity or by nicknamed identities, so you cannot see who they are. She has a partner, a fellow detective named Wade. He's Wade's character. I deliberately did this because I have the memory of a gnat. Is called Looking Glass. And Angela has a husband named Cal. We don't really know what Cal does for a living. I don't think he does anything for a living. They have 3 adopted white children who were Angela's former partner, who was killed during this event called the White Night, which happened a few years earlier, where this group called the 7th Cavalry came in and just killed all the cops in Tulsa. And only Angela and the chief of police, Judd Crawford, survived. Judd Crawford, played by 80s icon Don Johnson, Sonny Crockett, and also Nash Bridges. So it would be interesting to know how that phone call went, right? From Damon Lindoff saying, "Hey, Don, what are you up to these days? How would you like to be playing a cop?"
Well, Don Johnson played another similar character in a little indie film. What was it? I'll look it up.
Well, I mean, Don Johnson definitely is a guy who has built a career post Miami Vice playing cops. It's how we see him. So, the characters that we did get to bring into the modern
Dragged
world.
Across Concrete.
Yeah.
It was.
Ooh, that's a great title.
Yeah, it
Was,
stars Mel Gibson, Vince Vaughn.
I'll have to rent that.
It's a great
Was
movie.
we get to see Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias. We get to find out the fate of Dr. Manhattan. We get to find out the fate and see Silk Spectre 2, Laurie. I can never pronounce her first name, but she changed it to Blake after her father, the comedian, who is an interesting story unto itself. And Joe Keane Jr., who is the son of Keane, the person who put in the Keane Act, which made superheroes vigilantes. I do feel like I'm forgetting a key hero or character for that. Forgive me. I want to get a moment to think my thoughts.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I mean,
the plot of the story is very simple, which is that in the very first episode, we're introduced to Lou Gossett Jr. plays a guy named Will Reeves, and he is a handicapped African American who has some mysterious relationship to Angela. And over the course of the pilot episode, someone murders Don Johnson, the chief of police. Oh, yeah, spoiler alert. Sorry. And so, in a sense, just like The Watchmen begins with Rorschach investigating who killed the comedian, we go with a very traditional mystery noir thing, which is who killed. And it's interesting to point out that in the comic and in the film, well, the comedian was killed by Ozymandias because the comedian was going to get in his way. Whereas here, we find out just the opposite. We take the iconography of what makes Don Johnson so cool, and we find out what he's a racist, and that he was
maybe.
killed.
I don't even think that's ever established.
Well, yeah, he's a member of the 7th Cavalry.
Yeah, but there's
And they're
excuses made
racist.
for him. I mean, maybe he was doing it undercover. Maybe he wasn't.
No, his wife. They literally do what every superhero villain does. They talk about their motivation. But
Okay.
the key point is he's actually a bad guy. To the degree that we can say, well, he's a bad guy because he's a racist, it's hard to tell you is Will Reeves, who's in a wheelchair and kills Don Johnson. That's definitely the opposite of Ozymandias. So as the story unfolds, let's talk about that just briefly because I think it's important, is that instead of looking at the political institution of the government, because instead of having an extended Richard Nixon, we now have Robert Redford, who had been president for a funny week, right? Because one of Redford's big careers, film was in the early 70s, was All the President's Men, where he played Bob Woodward. But we know in this universe, the comedian killed Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. So, maybe they made the Sundance, Butch Cassidy and Sundance, but we have what is quote unquote a liberal progressive who when Adrian. So, how do you feel about the fact that it's almost an opposite kind of political universe from the national scale?
I don't
Right?
think it is.
We don't have any world. No, there's no World War III. There's no World War III because it accepts the premise of Moore's ending, which is that there's still fish, little squids falling from the sky through the dimensional portal. So people are still operating under that belief. But we no longer have a Cold War. We no longer have a particular right-wing president.
Well, there are still a lot of authoritarian elements to the civilization that has been constructed, and I think that's very smart on Lindelof's part. I mean, him and his team. I mean, they obviously understand that Moore is obsessed with authoritarianism. I mean, that's really the heart of the whole Watchmen idea. I mean, like the title
Right,
alone,
but
right?
it's kind of the bright and sunny world that we had been living in during the Obama administration, right? Redford gives reparations. They call them Redforations.
Right.
I mean, it's very much kind of like what the world looked like in 2015, where the fringier, nastier elements of our society had maybe took power on the local level, but not on the national level. If you were looking at America in 2015, right, you would have seen Obama, you would have seen progressive political policies, you would have seen a beautiful sheen of progress. And it's almost an identical world. It's better, right? Because there's reparations in this world. Redford is president. On some level, it's a clean smiley, bright future with no wars. But then what's the FBI up to, right?
I mean, I feel it's an authoritarian
There's,
universe.
but it's not. And reparations is not even remotely anything like trying to take over Vietnam. Come on, man. You got to give me this. You got to give me that on the surface, it is a liberal fantasy. You know, this is a positive universe on the most superficial level. No war, no impending World War III, a very progressive president. You even have good social things. But what you look beneath the surface is something just as malevolent, except it's on the grassroots. It's the local police. It's the people behind the scenes, like the 7th Cavalry. It's something very pernicious, but it's the kind of thing that you could, and I think it's a great comment that Lindelof is making, which is that instead of being a world, superhero comic books, you always see the villain wears black, right? The universe of right and wrong is so clear. And part of the deconstruction of the Watchmen is to kind of take it further out and say even the superhero under his benevolent mask can actually be quite evil. But here, even the very government that we see that looks like, oh no, we're 30 years past Reaganism, it's just a facade, it's just a veneer. And even if the president, even if the top of the pyramid is fine, institutional racism still exists. There are still a relationship between business, the group who funds the pyramid, which has, we see, this racist organization called the Pyramid and exists from the 1940s right through to the present day. There's still something behind the scenes that is very fascistic. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, yeah, I mean,
I mean, at the heart, what unites all of these adaptations is fascism, and the question of how those people who should be protecting us, we give them free reign also to go after us.
well, it's the notion of authoritarianism, right? More than fascism, I would say, and it's the idea that whatever is just, whatever is fair, whatever is right and wrong, it's determined by the personalities of the people who have the power, right? I mean,
Statism and seeing yourself as part of the state and losing your identity. And the very fact that the police mask themselves, on one hand, yeah, it keeps them from being identified. But on the other hand, by giving them costumes and masks, it also makes them part of something bigger than themselves. So their identity and responsibility as human beings are put aside for the service of authority. And that's straight up fascism.
yeah, yeah, okay, I can see that.
And it bears a really eerie and weird parallel because at the time of this recording, only just a handful of weeks ago, in Portland, Oregon, government officers dressed in paramilitary gear started grabbing protesters and throwing them in a van, and they had their faces covered. They had no identification, and they claimed the reason why they're these unmarked cars, you couldn't see badges, and their faces were covered was to protect the safety of those officers. But
Well, you know,
what a chilling sight.
there's a long history of officers, quote unquote, protecting their own safety, you know, by obscuring their identities, you know, in many countries, including the United States. I mean, in Mexico, you know, the armies that fight the drug cartels, they completely hide their identities now.
Right, but it's a concept that America is the premier democracy, which is why even an Englishman like Moore chooses America for the setting. It's why all of these films. It's something that is inherited in Reaganistic patriotic values. I'm sorry, this is a very political episode, but there's no way around it. That we don't deliver on our promise, just in the same way that superheroes don't deliver on their promise. And it's interesting to see the arcs of someone like a Laurie Blake, who has gone she's connected to all of the characters from the previous world, and she becomes intertwined with all the new characters in this world, and in relationship with Angela. They are really, even though Angela is the protagonist, and you could argue it's really her story, it's Laurie who kind of really unites the world of the comic book that came, the predecessor world, and this world. And her cynicism, which I really feel at the end is slightly tempered by their ability to bring Ozymandias to justice, if that's all she can achieve. And let's talk about the ending. Spoiler alert if you're still with us. But in this ending, and I really don't need to get too much into the plot, Dr. Manhattan knows he's going to die to at least allow his power to transfer via an egg to Angela, because he has learned in the course of the story how to be a human being, how to care, and how to feel, which is something that is kind of missing, I would argue, in both the Moore endings and the Snyder ending, which is a much more cynical take. And it's because, again, I really feel like this version is really Lindelof's tool for expressing his feeling. And I just feel like Lindelof, unlike Snyder and unlike Moore, is trying to find at least some positivity in what is otherwise a very dark tale. And you can see this in Lost, you can see this in The Leftovers, and in some sense, because he has 9 hours to tell the tale. He has both the legacy characters and his new characters. A lot of what I felt was missing from the film and what made the comic book work for me, I really feel works very much in the TV series. I actually prefer. Do I prefer the TV series to the film? In some ways, I do. Probably more so. Is it as good as the original source material? No, but to me, it seems like a far more interesting use of the source material. I don't think you feel the same way. You want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I've told you this before, but this is like the unnecessary sequel, right? The TV series. It's like it's a sequel no one asked for, no one needed. But that said, it's fun. It's a fun watch. I mean, I really, really, really liked his exploration of race issues in America. I thought that was a brilliant on him and his team's part. I mean, Alan Moore is a Brit. He probably doesn't understand stuff like that. I mean, I read an interview about Lindelof. He said in some interview where he went to like a very culturally, ethnically diverse high school. I don't know how true any of this is, but so
Well, he's from Teaneck, New Jersey, which, yeah, it's ethnically diverse, but super upper middle class.
Okay. So, I mean, he's at least rubbed some shoulders with people not
I'm sure there were
of his
a
race.
few lucky poor kids there, but
I mean, I did. I have my whole life went to very ethnically diverse schools. So
that's a good point. Let's segue right into this, because I want to say something and you've just kind of given me the perfect segue, which is Snyder, Lindelof, Hader, the screenwriter director, Alexei, and let's just deal with the directors Snyder and Lindelof. Lindelof is 4 months younger than me. I hate him. And Snyder is 4 months younger than me. I hate him. And Lindelof is about 2 years older than you. So all of these people, including Hader and they all basically, and I read in their biographies, they were all around the same age I was or you were when they read the comic, either as it came out later on when they would get a copy of them. So Moore is a product of the 60s. He is a proper boomer, as is Gibbons. But these are all Gen X interpretations. These all are basically people taking their favorite childhood or early young adult story and reimagining it through their Gen X sensibility. Do you feel, as a fellow member of Gen X, can you see that in these adaptations?
It's funny you say that. I think I do. When I was watching the movie, I did feel that, like, I guess Gen X has like a sense of cynicism, a sense of politics is like completely useless. Um, but
I mean, that's really kind of what defines us, right? I mean, on some level, we never liked heroes in the way that, like the boomers, they protested, they had ideals, maybe they hated Nixon, but they loved Kennedy. But they were idealists, and we were formed in the Counter-Reformation. So if they were idealists, we were pragmatists. If they had believed in heroes, we believed no one was a hero. There was a cynicism. And though Moore himself and Gibbons are squarely from that, I think in a weird way, they were the right people for the right time when they wrote this comic, because we were the receptive generation that really did want to see Batman as a fascist. We really wanted to see Superman as a God who may have no emotions. We really wanted to see all the hypocrisy. I mean, really, if you think about it, one of the great things about our generation is we just obsess over hypocrisy, right? We obsess over the moral inconsistencies, the using emotion to sell products, consumerism, the idealism. These are all an anathema to our generation.
Well, I think it's more like, let's just say it's Gen X. I think it's more like Gen X is just like has a complete apathy about it. It's like, this is just the way the world is, and it's not going to change. It's like Dr. Manhattan's final words. Let me just finish, Chris. Jesus.
Yeah, sorry.
Dr. Manhattan's final words, nothing ever changes. I mean, that's like the greatest slogan for that's the perfect slogan for Gen X.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly in Lindoff's mind, he finds a way of, as a middle-aged man, of putting a more positive spin on the end, that nothing ever changes as a good thing, as in a way that our lives continue in a cycle. And that's kind of nice. I mean, I think there's the teenager in the 80s or 90s, or the 20-something in the 80s or 90s, who reads this book and goes, man, it just proves the world's a fucked up place. And superheroes are fucked up. And what I think maybe I truly liked about Lindoff's take is he was trying to rectify. He was trying to find a realistic way of coming up with a happy ending without coming up with a fake ending. And maybe that's why I thought it speaks well to me. And it speaks to me of a more mature mind in that sense. Again, Snyder himself must have been in his 30s. Yeah, I think Snyder had to have been in his 30s, 11 years ago. He would have been in his late 30s, early 40s. And that's more the mentality of somebody who was still, I would argue, raging against stuff. And that was also a time, I think, 2009, in the aftermath of one of the most fascistic periods in our time, Bush, where it made sense. I mean, even though by the time the movie came out, Obama was president, not that it changed everything. I do feel that he at least captured a lot of the zeitgeist of the early aughts through his using Nixon in a Cold War scenario. How do you feel about that?
You think who captured it more, or?
No, Snyder. I mean, when Snyder's making the film in 2009, he's looking at what's going on with the Patriot Act. He's looking at how we got into a war in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's looking at those things, and instead of telling it in a modern way, he is using it subtextually by using Nixon and the Cold War and superheroes.
Well, I mean, he's just borrowing that from the comic, right? I mean,
he's borrowing it, but it's still potent and relevant in the time that he's telling the tale, because there's a cognate to the world that we live in today that makes a story about the past still seem relevant.
Well, we the Watchmen, the period of the Watchmen. Okay, so that's the period when Gen X was like on the stage, I guess you could say. That's a period
coming of age, forming its morals and thoughts.
Okay, well, that's a period of like, of apathy, of disenchantment with politics as usual. I mean, you could even argue that Donald Trump is like kind of the result of all that. I mean, why not vote for Trump? I mean, the system's stupid anyway. Everything's dumb.
Right, but I would also argue that what I like about Lindoff is he's saying, no, we don't have to be apathetic. There are things to care about. And in a weird way, maybe by switching away from the Cold War, which is really a non-issue, even in 2009, to something that has never escaped our society, which is racism, it does force us to have to make choices. I'm not saying I really want to not get more political than I already have gotten, but it's to say you can't just walk through life apathetically. And that's kind of what happens to Laurie Blake. In the comic book, it happens to Laurie and Dan. Even Manhattan, Dr. Manhattan's kind of checked out on the world. And we like to think that the cynicism of an Ozymandias just keeps on going. But he's brought to justice finally. And he's not brought to justice maybe because someone is super. It's because his own vanity, his own hubris betrays him. And then just a simple wrench on the head from the person who suffered the most under him, which is Wade. It's kind of a lovely revenge. Wade, who had been terrorized by the squid falling for so many decades, gets to finally take down the person who's caused him the most pain. And it's not like Wade's going to be a superhero after this. At best, maybe he'll hook up with Lori. What do you think? You think they hook up at the end?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
I don't know. I love
It's
the
a
fact that
happy ending.
Lindelof.
He's like
I
you're
love that
saying. He's trying
yeah,
to do a happy ending.
exactly. And I like how Lindelof said, "That's it. I'm done." Just like Moore. That's it. I'm done. I don't believe that you need to see more than just, in an era of 20 films to tell one tale at Marvel. It's kind of refreshing. So yeah, these were all labors of love. Moore, this was a labor of love. He found that he rediscovered what he loved about superheroes and comics in deconstructing it. I feel like Gibbons the same way. Snyder, all the people, Lindelof, they all on some level got to. Wouldn't you say that these are far more personal works than, say, the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man or any of the Joel Schumacher Batmans?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, all the Watchmen's are they're labors of love, like you're saying. They're for a much smaller audience. They're not for like an international world audience. I mean, the Watchmen show was on HBO, which is not a large audience. Yeah. So I mean, they're fun. I mean, you know, I feel like for a general audience, for a larger audience, watching the movie, even reading the comic, any of these adaptations, they would almost be they'd almost be lost. I mean, you're watching. I mean, I remember watching the Watchmen superhero movie, 2009 movie, just thinking like, it's skewering superheroes. It's destroying them. You know what I mean? And I was thinking, who's gonna like this movie besides me? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I and pretty much nobody did. But I mean,
But yet, I mean, in a way, that's how a cult movie is born, right? It's the right film in the wrong time. And it's interesting too, because I'm going to close this out. But one of the neat things about Snyder's Watchmen is the music. He actually used iconographic songs from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I don't think he used anything beyond the 80s, but he used songs that we knew. He used like Hallelujah. He used a lot of great songs to tell his story. And it's not until 2014 with Guardians of the Galaxy that James Gunn uses the same thing. And now we're beginning to see more and more uses of pop music in the superhero narrative. And one of the songs that I think is the best analogy for my closing thought, which is one of the songs that appears in it, and it's great because it works for the title, is All Along the Watchtower, a song written by Bob Dylan and probably better known by Jimi Hendrix and then covered again by U2. And I think for some of us, you know that song, right?
yes,
Okay, so what's the first version that you think of when you think of it?
Jimi Hendrix.
Right. So you think of the Hendrix version, right? Just in the way that we have some friends who watched the HBO miniseries who had never read the comic book and just liked the miniseries. Right? It existed. Even though Bob Dylan wrote it and has a really remarkable version, Hendrix's version exists just concurrently in the same way that Dylan's works exists. When I heard U2's cover of it, I knew that they were covering Hendrix. I did not know that they were actually covering Dylan. All three work on a lot of levels, and yet certainly they're a labor of love by Hendrix and by the U2, and they were certainly very important in meaning to Dylan, and yet they can all exist as art. And I feel like what's great about the comic book version of The Watchmen, the Snyder film version of The Watchmen, and the HBO adaptation is they're all quite lovely and quite important and quite significant while being all independent of each other. Thank you for joining us on this episode. I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
We'll talk again.